In the frozen mountains of Eastern Europe, enemy soldiers whispered a name that sent chills down their spines: the Ghost. They said she could kill from impossible distances, that she moved through the battlefield like smoke, and that once you were in her crosshairs, death was already knocking at your door. Some claim she wasn't human at all, but a spirit of vengeance born from the ashes of war. The truth was both simpler and more extraordinary than any legend. Her real name was Elena Vasquez, and she was about to become the most feared sniper in modern warfare. But her story didn't begin with a rifle in her hands or medals on her chest. It began with a promise made to a dying father, a burning village, and a young woman's desperate need for justice in a world gone mad. What the enemy soldiers didn't know was that Elena's greatest weapon wasn't her perfect aim or her ability to disappear into thin air. It was something far more dangerous. A heart that had been broken so completely that she had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. This is the story of how a small-town girl became a legend, how love turned into vengeance, and how one woman's war against an entire army changed the course of history forever. The morning mist clung to the valley like a funeral shroud, as Elena Vasquez adjusted the scope on her rifle for the third time. 300 meters below, the enemy patrol moved through the abandoned village of Kratovo, their boots echoing off empty cobblestones where children once played. She counted 12 soldiers, all heavily armed, all searching for something they would never find. Elena pressed her cheek against the cold metal of her weapon, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 6 months ago, she had been Elena Martinez, a veterinary student from a small mountain town, more comfortable treating wounded animals than taking human lives. Now, the locals called her La Fantasma, the Ghost. The enemy had their own name for her, whispered in fearful tones around their campfires. Der Todesengel, the Death Angel. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began on a Tuesday morning when her world collapsed in fire and smoke. Elena had been studying for her final exams at the veterinary college in San Marcos when the first shells hit her hometown of Valle Verde. The communication lines went down immediately, but fragments of news trickled through radio broadcasts. Foreign mercenaries had crossed the border. Government forces were retreating. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. For 3 days, Elena tried desperately to get home, hitchhiking through military checkpoints and walking when no vehicles would take her further into the war zone. The closer she got to Valle Verde, the more refugees she encountered fleeing in the opposite direction. Their faces told stories their words couldn't capture, hollow eyes that had seen too much, hands that shook even when they thought no one was watching. When Elena finally reached the ridge overlooking her hometown, she fell to her knees. Valle Verde was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, completely erased. Where colorful houses once lined the main street, only blackened foundations remained. The church where she had been baptized was a pile of rubble. The veterinary clinic where she had worked part-time during school holidays was nothing but a crater filled with twisted metal and ash. She found her father's body in what remained of their kitchen. Miguel Vasquez had been the town's police chief for 23 years, a man who knew every resident by name and had never fired his service weapon in anger. He died clutching a photograph of Elena's mother, who had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier. Beside him lay his hunting rifle, unused. Even in his final moments, Miguel had chosen to be a protector rather than a warrior. Elena buried her father behind the ruins of their home, using her bare hands to dig the grave because all the tools had been destroyed. As she placed stones over the fresh earth, she made a promise that would change her forever. She would find the men who did this. She would make them pay, and she would ensure that no other daughter would have to bury her father because of their cruelty. The transformation began immediately. Elena sold her textbooks and used the money to buy basic supplies, camping gear, a military surplus radio, and most importantly, her father's hunting rifle. Miguel had taught her to shoot when she was 12, claiming that a mountain girl needed to know how to protect herself. Elena had been a natural marksman, but she had always preferred photographing wildlife to hunting it. Those days of innocence were over. Elena's first target was a supply convoy traveling the mountain road between 2 enemy strongholds. She had been tracking their movements for weeks, learning their routines, identifying their weaknesses. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles and approximately 20 soldiers, odds that would have been impossible for any conventional attack. But Elena wasn't planning a conventional attack. She positioned herself on a cliff face 800 meters from the road, a distance that most snipers would consider extreme. Elena had spent days preparing the position, creating a natural blind that made her invisible from below while giving her a perfect view of the entire route. She had calculated wind speed, temperature, and humidity. She had studied the ballistics of her father's old rifle until she could predict every variable that might affect her shot. The convoy appeared exactly on schedule. Elena watched through her scope as the vehicles rumbled along the narrow mountain road, their engines echoing off the canyon walls. She identified the lead vehicle's commander, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek. According to her intelligence, this was Colonel Hans Dietrich, the mercenary leader responsible for the massacre at Valle Verde. Elena's hands remained perfectly steady as she prepared to take her first human life. She thought of her father's gentle smile, her mother's laughter, the children who had played in Valle Verde's streets. She thought of all the people who would never come home because of the man in her crosshairs. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder. Colonel Dietrich collapsed instantly, the bullet finding its mark with surgical precision. Before his men could even locate the source of the gunfire, Elena was already repositioning, moving to her secondary position 300 meters away. The convoy erupted into chaos. Soldiers scattered, seeking cover behind their vehicles while scanning the surrounding cliffs. They fired wildly at shadows, their bullets striking empty rocks while the real threat remained invisible. Elena waited patiently, watching their panic through her scope. Her second shot took out the radio operator, severing the convoy's communication with their headquarters. The third eliminated the driver of the rear vehicle, blocking any retreat. One by one, Elena picked off the officers and specialists, always from a different position, always invisible, always precise. By the time military reinforcements arrived 6 hours later, they found 12 dead soldiers and 11 survivors who swore they had been attacked by an entire squad of elite snipers. The survivors described impossible shots from impossible angles, a phantom enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. That night, as Elena cleaned her father's rifle by the light of a small campfire, she felt something die inside her. The veterinary student who had wanted to heal animals was gone forever. In her place sat a predator, cold and patient and utterly committed to her mission of vengeance. The local resistance movement found Elena 3 days later. Word of the convoy attack had spread throughout the mountains, and they needed to know who was responsible. They expected to find a team of trained soldiers. Instead, they discovered a 24-year-old woman sitting alone beside her father's grave, methodically cleaning a hunting rifle that was older than she was. Captain Rodriguez, the resistance leader, initially dismissed Elena as a liability. Women could be useful as nurses, cooks, or couriers, but combat was man's work. His opinion changed when Elena demonstrated her skills on the improvised firing range they had constructed in an abandoned quarry. At distances where most soldiers couldn't reliably hit a human-sized target, Elena could consistently place shots within a 2-inch circle. She could shoot accurately from prone, sitting, kneeling, or standing positions. She could compensate for wind, elevation, and moving targets with calculations that seemed to happen instinctively. Most impressively, Elena could do all of this while remaining completely calm under pressure. While other fighters showed signs of nervousness during training exercises, Elena's heart rate barely elevated. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands never shook. Within weeks, Elena had become the Resistance's most valuable asset. Intelligence gathering, supply line disruption, and high-value target elimination. She could accomplish missions that would require entire teams of conventional soldiers. Her success rate was perfect, her methodology was flawless, and her psychological impact on the enemy was immeasurable. The enemy began changing their patrol patterns, increasing security around their installations, and offering substantial bounties for information about the Ghost. Elite counter-sniper teams were brought in from overseas. Military psychologists studied the pattern of attacks, trying to develop a profile of their invisible adversary. Elena adapted to every countermeasure they developed. When they started using armored vehicles, she targeted their vision blocks and communications equipment. When they increased their patrol sizes, she learned to attack from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a larger force. When they brought in counter-snipers, she studied their techniques and turned their own methods against them. 6 months after the destruction of Valle Verde, Elena had become more than just a skilled marksman. She had evolved into something unprecedented in modern warfare. A one-woman army capable of paralyzing entire military units through fear alone. Enemy soldiers refused to patrol certain areas. Supply convoys required massive escorts that still provided no guarantee of safety. Intelligence reports spoke of a supernatural enemy who could kill from impossible distances and vanish without a trace. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. Elena had discovered that she possessed an almost inhuman capacity for patience, planning, and precision. She could remain motionless in a sniper's nest for 18 hours without discomfort. She could calculate complex ballistic equations in her head while under enemy fire. She could kill without hesitation, remorse, or psychological trauma. Most importantly, Elena had learned that war wasn't about courage or honor or patriotism. War was about mathematics, angles and distances, probabilities and statistics. If you could calculate the variables correctly, victory was simply a matter of time and patience. As Elena watched the enemy patrol moving through Kratovo's empty streets, she felt the familiar calm descend upon her. These 12 soldiers represented specific tactical challenges that required specific solutions. Wind speed was negligible. Range was well within her rifle's capabilities. Escape routes were mapped and prepared. She selected her first target, a sergeant who seemed to be coordinating the patrol's search pattern. Through her scope, Elena could see his face clearly. Young, probably no older than she was, possibly someone's son returning to someone's mother. For a moment, she wondered what his story was, what dreams he might have had before the war consumed them all. Then she thought of her father's face and her finger found the trigger. The shot rang out across the valley, and Elena Vasquez disappeared back into the mist, leaving behind only death and the growing legend of a ghost who walked among the living. The intelligence briefing arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, delivered by a teenage courier who had walked 30 kilometers through enemy territory to reach Elena's mountain hideout. The message was brief, but contained information that would change everything. General Viktor Kozlov, the architect of the ethnic cleansing campaign that had destroyed Vallaverde, would be visiting the forward command post at Firebase Alpha in exactly 1 week. Elena studied the reconnaissance photographs spread across her makeshift table, memorizing every detail of the fortified compound. Firebase Alpha sat atop a strategic hill overlooking 3 valleys, surrounded by razor wire, minefields, and overlapping fields of fire. The facility housed approximately 200 soldiers, including an elite special forces unit, specifically trained in counterinsurgency operations. Intelligence estimated that Kozlov would remain at the base for no more than 6 hours before departing via helicopter. For any conventional military force, assassinating Kozlov would require a massive assault that would likely fail and certainly result in enormous casualties. For Elena, it represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned about patience, precision, and the psychology of warfare. The planning phase consumed 3 full days. Elena studied topographical maps until she could visualize every ridge, every depression, every potential shooting position within a 5-kilometer radius of Firebase Alpha. She calculated ranges, wind patterns, and sight lines. She identified 17 possible sniper nests and systematically eliminated all but 3 based on escape route viability and shot difficulty. The chosen position was a natural cave formation on the north face of Mount Svaroga, approximately 1,400 meters from Firebase Alpha. The distance was extreme even by military sniper standards, requiring Elena to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the rotation of the Earth itself. Most importantly, the position would allow her to observe the target area for an extended period while remaining completely invisible to counter-sniper teams. Elena spent 2 days hiking to Mount Svaroga, moving only at night and following game trails that wouldn't appear on any military map. She carried minimal equipment: her rifle, ammunition, basic survival gear, and a small notebook in which she recorded wind patterns, temperature fluctuations, and the daily routines of the soldiers below. The cave she had selected was barely large enough for one person, carved into the mountain face by centuries of wind and water erosion. From inside, Elena had a perfect view of Firebase Alpha through a narrow opening that would be invisible from below. She arranged rocks and debris around the entrance, creating a natural camouflage that would withstand scrutiny from helicopters or reconnaissance drones. For 3 days, Elena observed the enemy base through her rifle scope, learning the patterns that would determine her success or failure. She watched soldiers conduct morning formations, noted the timing of guard changes, and identified the helicopter landing pad where Kozlov would arrive. She studied the way shadows fell across the compound at different times of day, memorizing the positions where sentries were most alert and where their attention was most likely to wander. The base's security was impressive, but not impenetrable. The soldiers were well-trained and disciplined, but they had been stationed at Firebase Alpha for months without incident. Complacency was inevitable, and Elena learned to recognize its subtle signs. Guards who checked their watches more frequently than their surroundings. Sentries who focused more on staying warm than scanning for threats. On the 3rd day of observation, Elena noticed something that made her recalculate her entire approach. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Steiner, conducted a daily inspection tour at exactly 1400 hours, walking the perimeter with 2 adjutants and examining defensive positions. The tour followed an invariable route and timing, lasting precisely 45 minutes. More importantly, at 14:15 hours, Colonel Steiner always paused at the northeast observation point to survey the surrounding valleys through binoculars. For approximately 30 seconds, he would stand completely motionless in a position that provided Elena with a clear shot. The range was challenging but manageable, 1,100 meters with a slight upward angle and predictable wind patterns. Elena faced a tactical decision that would define her mission. She could wait for Kozlov's arrival and attempt the more difficult 1,400-meter shot, or she could eliminate Colonel Steiner first, creating chaos that would disrupt the general's visit entirely. Both options carried risks, but Elena's instincts favored the more aggressive approach. Colonel Steiner represented more than just a military target. Intelligence reports indicated that he had personally overseen the massacre at Valle Verde, selecting which buildings to burn and which civilians to execute. Elena had been tracking his movements for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Now that opportunity had presented itself as part of a larger mission. Elena spent the night before her attack in deep meditation, using techniques her father had taught her during their hunting expeditions. Miguel had believed that successful marksmanship required more than technical skill. It demanded a unity of mind, body, and purpose that could only be achieved through complete mental preparation. Elena cleared her thoughts of everything except the mechanical aspects of her mission: wind speed, bullet trajectory, target movement patterns. At 0600 hours, Elena began her final preparations. She cleaned her rifle meticulously, checking every component for flaws that could compromise accuracy. She prepared her shooting position, adjusting rocks and debris to create the perfect rest for her weapon. She calculated the precise holdover required for an 1,100-meter upward shot, accounting for the mountain's altitude and the morning air density. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. Elena watched the base through her scope, noting the routine activities that indicated normal operations. Supply trucks arrived on schedule. Helicopter patrols departed and returned without incident. Guard details changed with clockwork precision. At 13:55 hours, Colonel Steiner emerged from the command bunker with his usual entourage. Elena tracked his movement through her scope, noting his confident stride and the casual way he gestured while speaking to his adjutants. The colonel showed no awareness that death was watching him from the mountain above. Elena controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate through techniques that had become second nature. Her rifle was perfectly zeroed, her position was stable, and her calculations were precise. In approximately 15 minutes, Colonel Steiner would pause at the northeast observation point, and Elena would have her window of opportunity. The patrol followed its predictable route around the perimeter. Elena tracked their progress, noting each checkpoint they passed and comparing their timing to previous days. Everything was proceeding normally until she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A counter-sniper team was setting up equipment on the base's highest observation tower. Elena watched through her scope as 2 soldiers assembled a sophisticated optical surveillance system, complete with thermal imaging capabilities and computer-assisted target tracking. The system was oriented toward the exact mountain range where Elena was hidden, suggesting that intelligence had identified her general area of operations. For the first time in months, Elena felt a flutter of genuine fear. The cave position that had seemed so perfectly concealed might have been compromised by thermal signatures or satellite reconnaissance. If the counter-sniper team detected her muzzle flash, she would be trapped on the mountain face with no escape route. Elena had two choices: abort the mission and retreat, or accelerate her timeline and take the shot before the surveillance system became fully operational. The first option was safer, but meant losing an irreplaceable opportunity. The second option was enormously risky, but offered the chance to eliminate two high-value targets in a single operation. Elena's training and instincts demanded the aggressive approach. She adjusted her rifle's position, targeting the counter-sniper team instead of waiting for Colonel Steiner's routine appearance. The range was slightly greater, 1,200 meters, but the angle was more favorable. More importantly, eliminating the surveillance team would restore her tactical advantage while creating maximum psychological impact. At 14:07 hours, Elena fired her first shot. The bullet traveled across the valley in complete silence, striking the primary surveillance operator in the center of his chest. The soldier collapsed instantly, his body falling across the expensive equipment he had been calibrating. His partner looked around in confusion, unable to identify the source of the attack. Elena was already repositioning for her second shot when the base alarm system activated. Sirens wailed across Firebase Alpha as soldiers scrambled to defensive positions. The counter-sniper's partner was frantically attempting to restart the surveillance equipment when Elena's second bullet found its target. Now came the most critical phase of the operation. Elena knew that her muzzle flash had been visible to trained observers, providing them with a general direction for their counterattack. Artillery would be ranging her position within minutes, and helicopter gunships would be airborne shortly thereafter. But Elena also knew that Colonel Steiner would be rushing to his command post to coordinate the base's response. His route would take him past the northeast observation point at approximately 14:12 hours, providing Elena with one final opportunity before she had to withdraw. Through her scope, Elena watched the chaos spreading throughout Firebase Alpha. Soldiers were running between positions, officers were shouting orders, and vehicles were starting engines in preparation for immediate deployment. In the midst of this confusion, Elena spotted her primary target. Colonel Steiner was indeed rushing toward the command bunker, but he had deviated from his normal path to investigate the situation at the observation tower. He paused directly beneath the tower, looking up at his fallen counter-snipers while speaking rapidly into a handheld radio. The range was 1,300 meters, the target was moving, and Elena was operating under extreme time pressure. Any one of these factors would have made the shot extremely difficult. Combined, they created what most snipers would consider an impossible challenge. Elena adjusted her scope, calculated the necessary lead time, and controlled her breathing despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Through the crosshairs, she could see Colonel Steiner's face clearly, weathered features hardened by years of combat, eyes that showed no remorse for the atrocities he had committed. The shot was perfect. Colonel Steiner fell beside the observation tower, his radio clattering across the concrete as his body convulsed and then went still. The soldiers around him dove for cover, scanning the surrounding mountains while their commanding officer's blood pooled beneath the Albanian flag that flew above Firebase Alpha. Elena was already crawling toward the cave's rear exit when the first artillery shells impacted the mountain face. The enemy had identified her approximate position and was saturating the entire area with high explosive rounds. Rock fragments filled the air as blast waves shook the mountain, but Elena's escape route led through a narrow fissure that provided protection from all but a direct hit. She emerged from the cave system 600 meters down the mountain's rear slope, well beyond the artillery's target zone. Behind her, Firebase Alpha was in complete chaos. Helicopter searchlights swept the mountainside while ground teams prepared to conduct a detailed sweep of the entire area. Elena disappeared into the forest, leaving behind no trace except for 2 empty cartridge cases and the growing legend of a ghost who could kill from impossible ranges and vanish before anyone could respond. News of Colonel Steiner's assassination spread throughout the region within hours. Enemy morale, already strained by months of ghost attacks, plummeted to new lows. Soldiers began requesting transfers away from sniper-vulnerable positions. Supply convoys required massive escorts that still provided no guarantee of safety. Most importantly for Elena's mission, General Kozlov's visit was indefinitely postponed. Intelligence indicated that the general was now refusing to travel anywhere within Elena's suspected operational area, effectively confining himself to headquarters facilities far from the front lines. Elena had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare. A single sniper had successfully altered enemy strategy at the highest levels. But as she made her way back to her mountain hideout, Elena knew that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The enemy would adapt, bringing in more sophisticated equipment and more experienced counter-sniper teams. The war was entering a new phase, and Elena would need to evolve once again if she hoped to survive and continue her mission of vengeance. The girl who had buried her father was gone forever. The veterinary student who had wanted to heal animals existed only in memory. What remained was something harder and more dangerous than her enemies could imagine. A predator who had learned to hunt the hunters. A ghost who walked among the living and left only death in her wake. The abandoned monastery of San Miguel perched on the edge of a 1,000-foot cliff like a stone prayer frozen in time. For 2 centuries, it had housed monks who sought isolation from the world's violence. Now, 3 months after Colonel Steiner's death, it had become Elena's most dangerous hiding place and her most effective base of operations. Elena chose the monastery not for its spiritual significance, but for its tactical advantages. The single-access road was easily monitored, the stone construction provided excellent protection from small arms fire, and the bell tower offered a commanding view of the entire Rosario Valley. Most importantly, the enemy considered it an unlikely hiding spot for a sniper. Too exposed, too isolated, too obvious. That perception was exactly what made it perfect. Elena had been studying intercepted communications for weeks, piecing together fragments of the enemy's evolving counter-strategy. General Kozlov had indeed confined himself to heavily fortified headquarters, but his isolation was creating command problems that threatened the entire occupation. Field commanders were making independent decisions, supply lines were becoming increasingly disorganized, and tactical coordination was breaking down. The enemy needed a new approach, and Elena's intelligence sources suggested they had found one. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a renowned counter-sniper specialist from the British Special Air Service, had been brought in specifically to hunt the Ghost. Mitchell's reputation was formidable. She had eliminated insurgent snipers in 3 different conflicts, using psychological warfare and advanced technology to turn the hunters into the hunted. Elena studied Mitchell's service record with professional respect and growing concern. Unlike the conventional soldiers she had been facing, Mitchell understood the sniper's mindset. She knew how to think like her prey, anticipate their movements, and exploit their psychological vulnerabilities. More dangerously, Mitchell had resources that previous counter-sniper teams lacked. Satellite surveillance, thermal imaging drones, and sophisticated computer modeling systems that could predict probable sniper locations based on historical attack patterns. The psychological component was perhaps most troubling. Mitchell's previous operations had demonstrated an understanding of how isolation and constant vigilance affected a sniper's mental state. She knew how to create pressure that would force her targets into mistakes, how to exploit the loneliness that was every sniper's greatest weakness. Elena's first indication that Mitchell had arrived came through an unusual pattern of enemy activity. Instead of the predictable patrols and supply runs that had characterized previous operations, the enemy began conducting seemingly random movements throughout the valley. Convoys would change routes without warning. Patrols would double back on their own tracks, and helicopter flights followed erratic patterns that suggested no specific destination. To an untrained observer, the activity appeared chaotic. Elena recognized it as sophisticated psychological warfare. Mitchell was creating the illusion of vulnerability while actually gathering intelligence about Elena's position and methods. Every convoy that changed routes was equipped with sensors that recorded environmental data. Every patrol that doubled back was searching for signs of observation. Every helicopter was mapping potential sniper nests with millimeter precision. Elena realized she was facing her most dangerous opponent yet. Someone who understood that sniper warfare was ultimately a contest of minds rather than weapons. The first direct contact came on a foggy morning in late October. Elena was conducting routine surveillance of the valley floor when she noticed something that made her freeze. A glint of reflected light from a ridge approximately 2 kilometers away, exactly the kind of scope reflection that would be invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. Captain Mitchell had found her. Elena remained motionless, fighting the instinct to immediately relocate. Mitchell would be watching for exactly that reaction. Any sudden movement would confirm Elena's position, and provide the counter-sniper with targeting data. Instead, Elena slowly adjusted her position, using the monastery's stone walls to break any potential sight lines while maintaining her ability to observe the distant ridge. Through her scope, Elena studied the area where she had detected the reflection. The position was expertly chosen, excellent fields of fire, multiple escape routes, and natural camouflage that would be invisible from ground level. More importantly, the range was approximately 2,000 meters, beyond the effective capability of Elena's hunting rifle, but well within the range of military sniper weapons. Elena was being hunted by someone with superior equipment and institutional support. For the first time since beginning her campaign of vengeance, she was not the predator in this relationship. The standoff lasted 4 hours. Elena remained hidden within the monastery while Mitchell maintained her distant position, each waiting for the other to make a tactical mistake. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the valley, Elena made a calculated decision. She would not win a waiting game against an opponent with better resources and unlimited time. Elena began what appeared to be a careful withdrawal from the monastery, moving slowly and deliberately toward the rear exit while remaining concealed from Mitchell's position. She wanted to create the impression of cautious retreat while actually positioning herself for a flanking maneuver that would reverse their tactical relationship. The monastery's construction included a network of underground passages that connected to natural cave systems throughout the mountain. Elena had spent weeks mapping these passages, identifying multiple routes that would allow her to move undetected across several kilometers of apparently open terrain. What Mitchell saw as advantageous high ground could become a trap if approached from unexpected directions. Elena's flanking route required 6 hours of careful movement through narrow passages and steep climbs. She emerged from the cave system approximately 800 meters behind Mitchell's suspected position, having approached from the one direction that offered no view of the monastery. If her calculations were correct, the British sniper would still be watching Elena's last known position while remaining completely vulnerable to attack from the rear. The reality was even better than Elena had hoped. Through her scope, she could see Captain Mitchell's hide site clearly, a sophisticated construction of camouflage netting and artificial foliage that would be invisible from the front, but obvious when viewed from behind. Mitchell was indeed still focused on the monastery, apparently unaware that her prey had become her hunter. Elena studied her opponent through the rifle scope, noting details that would be crucial for the coming confrontation. Mitchell was approximately 30 years old, with the lean build of someone who spent months at a time in the field. Her equipment was state-of-the-art military hardware, a precision rifle with advanced optics, communications gear that probably included satellite uplinks, and sensors that could detect movement or heat signatures across vast distances. Most importantly, Mitchell showed the same patience and discipline that Elena had developed over months of independent operations. She remained motionless for hours, her attention never wavering from her target area, her position never compromising, despite the physical discomfort that came with extended surveillance. Elena realized she was looking at a mirror image of herself, another predator shaped by training and experience into something beyond normal human limitations. The only difference was motivation. Mitchell was a professional soldier following orders. Elena was driven by something more dangerous than duty or patriotism. Elena was motivated by love transformed into vengeance, and that made her willing to take risks that no professional would consider acceptable. Elena adjusted her rifle for an 800-meter shot with significant wind drift. The range was challenging but manageable, well within her demonstrated capabilities. More importantly, Mitchell's position offered no cover from this angle. The camouflage that concealed her from the front provided no protection from rear attack. Elena controlled her breathing and aligned her crosshairs with Mitchell's center mass. A single shot would eliminate her most dangerous opponent and restore the psychological advantage that had made her previous operations so effective. The enemy would be reminded that the Ghost could strike from any direction at any time without warning. Elena's finger began applying pressure to the trigger when something made her pause. Through her scope, she could see Mitchell's face in profile, noting the concentration and professional dedication that were mirror images of Elena's own mindset. This was a soldier doing her job, following orders from commanders who had never experienced the horror of watching their hometown burn. For a moment, Elena wondered if Mitchell had family waiting for her return, parents who worried about their daughter's dangerous profession. Perhaps a husband or children, who counted days until her deployment ended. Elena thought about the grief she would cause, the lives she would shatter with a single bullet. Then Elena remembered her father's face as she found him in the ruins of their kitchen, and her finger completed its pressure on the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder. Through her scope, Elena watched Captain Mitchell collapse forward, her body falling across the sophisticated equipment that had failed to save her life. The counter-sniper's rifle slid down the rocky slope, clattering against stones as it disappeared into a ravine far below. Elena felt no satisfaction from the kill, only a cold professional acknowledgement that a threat had been eliminated. Mitchell had been a worthy opponent who deserved respect, but she had also been an obstacle to Elena's mission of vengeance. Personal feelings were luxuries that Elena could no longer afford. The immediate aftermath of Mitchell's death exceeded Elena's expectations. Within hours, enemy communications were buzzing with panicked reports and urgent requests for additional security. The psychological impact of losing their premier counter-sniper specialist was devastating. If Captain Mitchell could be killed, then no one was safe from the Ghost. Enemy patrols began operating in larger groups, with multiple snipers providing overwatch. Convoy security was increased to the point where supply runs became logistically impossible. Most importantly, several high-ranking officers requested immediate transfers away from the operational area, citing the impossibility of conducting effective operations while under constant threat from an invisible enemy. But Elena also understood that Mitchell's death would bring consequences she was unprepared to handle. The enemy would escalate their response, bringing in resources and personnel that would eventually overwhelm her individual capabilities. She had won this battle, but the war was entering a phase that would require different tactics and different risks. Elena spent her final night at the monastery writing in a journal she had been keeping since her father's death. The entries chronicled her transformation from veterinary student to legendary sniper, recording not just tactical lessons but emotional changes that she was only beginning to understand. She had become efficient at killing, but each death took something from her that could never be recovered. She had learned to live without human companionship, but the isolation was creating psychological stresses that threatened her operational effectiveness. Most dangerously, she had discovered that vengeance was an hunger that grew stronger with each feeding rather than weaker. Elena's mission had begun with a simple goal: punish the men who destroyed Valverde and killed her father. But success had created new objectives that seemed to expand endlessly. Every enemy she eliminated was replaced by others who required elimination. Every tactical victory created new strategic challenges that demanded more sophisticated responses. Elena was winning every battle, while slowly losing herself to the war that consumed everything she had once been. As dawn broke over the monastery, Elena gathered her equipment and prepared to abandon another temporary refuge. The enemy would eventually search this location, and staying would mean certain death. But leaving meant accepting that she would never again have a place to call home, never again experience the peace that normal people took for granted. Elena shouldered her rifle and walked toward the cliff edge, looking down at the valley where her enemies moved like insects across the landscape. Somewhere below, men were planning her destruction with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to theirs. The war had become personal for both sides, and Elena understood that it would end only when one side was completely destroyed. She disappeared into the morning mist, leaving behind only death and the growing certainty that she was becoming something more dangerous than her enemies could comprehend. The Ghost had evolved beyond human limitations, becoming a force of nature that existed solely to balance the scales of justice through violence. But forces of nature, Elena was beginning to realize, could be as destructive to themselves as to their enemies. Winter arrived early in the mountains, bringing with it a cold that seemed to freeze Elena's soul as thoroughly as it froze the ground beneath her feet. 6 weeks had passed since Captain Mitchell's death, and the enemy's response had transformed the entire operational landscape. What began as a personal mission of vengeance had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than Elena had ever imagined. The valley that had once been Elena's hunting ground now resembled a militarized zone from a science fiction nightmare. Thermal imaging drones circled overhead in constant patterns, their sensors capable of detecting body heat through several feet of snow and rock. Motion-sensing devices had been scattered throughout the forest, creating an invisible network that could triangulate any movement larger than a rabbit. Most ominously, the enemy had begun using artificial intelligence systems that analyzed patterns of past attacks to predict probable sniper locations with frightening accuracy. Elena studied these developments from her latest hideout, a natural ice cave formed by underground springs that kept the interior temperature just above freezing. The location was miserable but strategically sound. The flowing water masked her heat signature from thermal sensors. The cave's depth put her beyond the range of ground-penetrating radar, and the constant sound of dripping water would muffle any noise she might make. More importantly, the cave system connected to a network of underground passages that extended for kilometers in every direction. Elena had spent weeks mapping these tunnels, creating escape routes that would allow her to appear and disappear across a vast area while remaining completely undetected. What the enemy saw as an impenetrable surveillance network, Elena was learning to use as camouflage for movements they couldn't track or predict. The psychological pressure of operating under constant observation was taking its toll. Elena found herself second-guessing decisions that had once been instinctive, spending hours analyzing potential threats that might not exist. Sleep became irregular and troubled by dreams that mixed memories of her father with images of the people she had killed. Food lost its taste, reduced to fuel that kept her body functioning rather than something to be enjoyed. Most troubling were the moments when Elena caught herself talking aloud, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions who provided the human interaction she desperately needed. She had developed different voices for different aspects of her personality. The tactical planner who analyzed enemy movements, the emotional survivor who remembered life before the war, and increasingly, a cold voice that whispered about the necessity of eliminating anyone who threatened her mission. Elena recognized these as symptoms of prolonged isolation and stress, but recognition didn't provide solutions. She couldn't risk human contact that might compromise her operational security, and she couldn't abandon her mission when so much remained unfinished.